Why you can't talk about money, even with the people closest to you. It is 11:40 on a Tuesday night and your partner is asleep in the next room, phone still glowing on the nightstand. You are alone at the kitchen table with a banking app open, thumb hovering over a number you have refreshed 4 times in the last 10 minutes as if refreshing it might change what it says. You have already decided you will not mention this tonight. You decided the same thing last Tuesday, and the Tuesday before that. Somewhere in the apartment, someone who loves you does not know what you know. Not because you are lying to them, because you have never found a sentence small enough to say it in. This is not a story about money. It is a story about the specific kind of loneliness that happens when the person closest to you in the world becomes, on this one subject, a stranger you are managing instead of a partner you are trusting. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, Book 9, Paragraph 1, that a person who does wrong to another does wrong first to their own character. The uncomfortable truth this video will ask you to sit with is that silence can do the same damage as a lie. You have not deceived anyone. You have simply let a number live in a drawer where a conversation should be. And the space that number is expanding into is not your bank account. It is the distance between you and the people you claim to trust the most. The number you have never said out loud. You know the exact figure, not roughly. Exactly. You could recite it faster than your own phone number because you check it more often than you check anything else in your life. And yet, if the person across the dinner table from you asked, right now, what that number is, something in your chest would tighten before your mouth even opened. Notice that. The tightening comes before the lie does. Your body objects to the silence before your mind finds a way to justify it. We tell ourselves the number is private because money is complicated, because context matters, because they would not understand the decisions behind it. These are not reasons. They are architecture, built quietly over years, designed to protect something that has nothing to do with math. Here is what almost no one admits. The number itself was never the secret. The secret is what you believe the number says about you. A 28-year-old client once told a therapist she would rather describe her worst sexual experience in detail than say her salary out loud in a room of friends. She was not being dramatic. She was being honest about a hierarchy of shame most people never examine. Seneca observed in Letters to Lucilius, Letter 2, that the mind that hops from one hiding place to another never actually rests anywhere. That is what a hidden number does inside a relationship. It does not sit still. It moves. It hides behind small lies about a purchase, behind a change of subject, behind a joke that deflects a question a half-second too fast. You are not protecting a number. You are protecting a story about your own worth that you have never tested out loud, because some part of you suspects it will not survive contact with another person's face. What would happen if it did not need to survive? What if the story was never true in the first place, and the only reason it feels true is that no one has ever been allowed close enough to disprove it? Silence was never your idea. Think about the first time you learned that money was not something you discussed at the table. No one sat you down and taught it directly. You absorbed it the way children absorb everything that matters, by watching what made the adults around you go quiet. Maybe it was a phone call your parent took in another room, voice dropping to a register you were not meant to hear. Maybe it was the specific way your mother's face changed when a relative asked how the business was doing. You did not need an explanation. You learned the rule by watching the silence enforce itself. Here is the part that should stop you. That silence was never a philosophy. It was a survival response, inherited by someone who was frightened, and passed to you the way a flinch is passed down, before either of you ever agrees to it consciously. You did not choose this. You inherited it, the same way you inherited a jawline or a way of laughing, except this inheritance cost you something every single week. Epictetus argued in Discourses, Book 1, Chapter 1, that some things lie within our power and some do not, and that confusing the two is the root of nearly all human suffering. Your parents' fear was not within your power. What you do with the silence they handed you at this exact moment in your life is entirely within yours. Most people never make that distinction. They simply keep performing an inherited script, assuming it is personality rather than programming. Ask yourself something uncomfortable. When you avoid the conversation tonight, whose fear are you actually protecting? Yours, or the one that was handed to you before you were old enough to refuse it? The answer changes nothing about tonight's dinner table, but it changes everything about tomorrow's if you let it. The inheritance was never a choice you made. What you do with it, starting at the next dinner table you sit down at, is the first choice that has ever actually belonged to you. What are you actually protecting? Say the sentence out loud right now, alone, in whatever room you are in. I am not where I thought I would be financially. Notice what happens in your throat. Notice the small, immediate impulse to soften it, to add a qualifier, to explain the context before anyone has even asked for one. That impulse is not about money. That impulse is about being seen as someone who failed a test nobody else in your life can see you take. Here's the sentence people are actually terrified of saying to someone they love. Not, I owe more than I told you. The real sentence underneath it is, I might not be as capable as you believed I was. Consider a couple married 9 years. The husband hit a 5-figure balance for 11 months, not because he was reckless with money, but because admitting it meant admitting a version of himself he had not agreed to become. He described the day it was discovered as more painful than the debt itself. The debt was a number. The discovery was a mirror. This is the trap. You believe the silence protects the relationship. It does not. It protects your self-image from the relationship, which is a very different thing and a much more selfish one, however unintentional. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, Book 4, paragraph 18, that a person gains extraordinary peace by paying attention to their own actions rather than what others think, say, or do. Notice what he did not say. He did not say ignore what others might discover about you. He said stop performing for an imagined verdict that has not even been delivered yet. You are rehearsing a courtroom that does not exist. The person across from you has not convicted you of anything. You convicted yourself first in private, and then built an entire architecture of silence to avoid the sentencing. But a verdict you invented can also be overturned by you. The question is whether you are willing to walk into the room you have been avoiding and find out the trial was never real. The math you do about being loved. There is a private calculation almost everyone runs and almost no one names. It goes something like this. If they knew the real number, would they still choose me? You have run this calculation more times than you can count, usually late at night, usually after a purchase you regret, usually in the specific silence that follows turning off a light and staring at a ceiling instead of at the person beside you. This is where money stops being about money entirely. It becomes a stand-in for a much older, much rawer question. Am I loved for who I am, or for the version of me that manages to look competent? A woman once described in a financial therapy session, sitting frozen for 6 minutes before telling her fiancé about a debt she had carried since university. 6 minutes of silence, in a room where nothing dangerous was happening except the fear inside her own head. She said afterward that the silence felt louder than any conversation she had ever had. Sit with this specific fact. Financial secrecy correlates more strongly with relationship dissatisfaction than almost any other category of secret, including infidelity in some studies. Read that again. Not because money matters more than fidelity, because the secrecy itself, the daily maintenance of a hidden self, corrodes trust in a way confrontation never could. You are not being loved less because of the number. You are being distanced from love because of the wall you built to protect yourself from finding out. Seneca wrote in Letters to Lucilius, Letter 6, that no one can live well who thinks only of their own advantage, and that the sharing of self is what makes a friendship rather than a transaction. A relationship where one person manages information for the other's comfort is not a partnership anymore. It is a performance, staged nightly. For an audience of one person, you claim to trust completely. The math you keep running was never about affordability. It was about whether you believe you are lovable without the mask. And you have never let anyone answer that question honestly, because you have never asked it honestly either. Why we are fine is the most expensive sentence you own. 2 words. Said in the car, said over dinner, said in response to a worried glance from someone who loves you. We are fine. It costs nothing to say, and over years, it becomes the most expensive sentence in your entire financial life. Here is why. Every time you say it, and it is not entirely true, you are not just avoiding one conversation. You are quietly training the other person to stop asking. You are teaching them that your face, when checked, will always report calm weather, regardless of the storm underneath it. That training works. It works so well that eventually they stop noticing when something is actually wrong, because you have spent years perfecting the performance of nothing being wrong at all. Consider what happens in a small business where two partners run monthly numbers separately, each telling the other, "We are fine," because neither wants to be the one who breaks the calm. By the time the truth surfaces, the gap between the story and the balance sheet is not a small correction. It is a crisis wearing the disguise of a sudden event, when it was never sudden at all. "We are fine." Said enough times, it stops being a report and becomes a wall. Epictetus argued, in Discourses, Book 2, Chapter 2, that a person who wishes to be free must neither desire nor fear things outside their own control, and must instead master their own judgments before anything else. The judgment you keep avoiding mastering is small and specific. It is the decision to describe your actual situation instead of the situation you wish were true. This is not about honesty as a virtue in the abstract. It is about the compounding interest of a small untruth, repeated on a schedule, until the account of trust between two people is quietly overdrawn. You will not notice the moment it happens. There is no single Tuesday where "we are fine" breaks something. There is only the week months later when something finally cracks, and neither of you can explain exactly when the fault line started. It started on an ordinary night, with two words, and a silence that felt smaller than it actually was, the parent who never said it either. Picture your father's hands the last time money came up at a family gathering. Picture how quickly the subject changed, how someone laughed a little too fast, how the room found something else to discuss within seconds. You learned the choreography before you learned the reason for it. Here is a truth families rarely examine directly. Financial silence is not usually selfish. It is usually inherited protection, passed down from someone who was taught by someone before them that vulnerability about money invited judgment, or worse, invited someone leaving. A man in his 50s once realized, mid-conversation with his own adult son, that he was repeating word for word the same deflection his own father had used 40 years earlier. Same pause, same joke, same subject change. He had spent his entire adult life believing he had rejected his father's coldness, only to discover he had simply inherited its exact mechanics. That is the part that should unsettle you. You may believe you are different from the parent who taught you silence, but mechanics repeat themselves quietly, underneath the story you tell about your own personality. Marcus Aurelius wrote, in Meditations, Book 1, Paragraph 17, that he was grateful to have learned, from those who raised him, both the good habits worth keeping and the ability to notice which ones were not worth keeping at all. That second half is the part almost no one does the work on. Noticing is not blame. Noticing is the only exit door that exists. You did not choose the first silence. You can choose whether the next one, the one waiting for you at your own dinner table tonight, gets repeated exactly as it was handed to you, or finally gets interrupted. There is a version of you sitting at a future family gathering, watching your own child learn the choreography of silence by watching your face. The only question left is what, exactly, you are about to teach them, what your body knows before your mouth admits. Notice the physical sensation the next time a money conversation approaches, the slight quickening in your chest, the urge to check your phone, the sudden urgent need to change the subject to something, anything, that feels safer. That is not anxiety about numbers. Numbers do not make your palms damp. Numbers do not tighten your jaw. What tightens your jaw is the anticipated verdict, the imagined disappointment on a face you care about, arriving before a single word has actually been spoken. Your nervous system is running a threat assessment on a conversation, not a calculation. A financial counselor once noted that clients could recite complex interest rates and repayment schedules with total composure, then physically freeze the moment asked to say those same numbers to a spouse. The math was never the obstacle. The witness was. Remember this specific fact. The human brain processes social judgment and physical danger through overlapping neural pathways. Your body genuinely cannot always distinguish between I am about to be attacked and I am about to be seen as inadequate by someone I love. It reacts to both with the same flood of protective chemistry. This explains something you have probably never named. You are not avoiding a conversation. You are avoiding what feels to an ancient part of your nervous system like exposure to real danger. Seneca observed in Letters to Lucilius, Letter 13, that the mind inflicts more pain on itself through what it imagines than events ever inflict through what actually happens, and that most of what terrifies people has not occurred and very likely never will. He was not writing about spreadsheets, he was describing exactly this. The rehearsal of a catastrophe that exists nowhere except inside your own chest, hours before any actual conversation occurs. Your body has been treating a 5-minute conversation like a physical threat for years. It has never once been right about the outcome. And yet tomorrow, faced with the same conversation, it will very likely sound the same alarm again, unless something interrupts the pattern deliberately. The version of you that only exists in spreadsheets. There is a version of you that exists only in private, late at night, in the glow of a banking app or a budgeting spreadsheet nobody else has ever opened. This version knows things the public version of you has never admitted. This version has run numbers the public version has never spoken aloud. Here's the strange part. That private version is often more honest, more disciplined, more in contact with reality than the version you present to the people closest to you. You have built an entire second identity, one that exists exclusively in rows and columns, because it felt safer to be honest with a spreadsheet than with a spouse. You know this person. You have been them at 1 a.m., recalculating a number for the 4th time, more emotionally intimate with that spreadsheet than with the person sleeping down the hall. A therapist specializing in financial infidelity once observed that many clients kept meticulous, accurate private records of debts or spending they had never disclosed to a partner. The secrecy was not disorganization. It was the opposite. It was careful, deliberate management of a truth kept permanently out of view. That takes energy. Enormous, continuous energy, spent maintaining 2 separate versions of your financial life, one that is real and one that is presentable. Marcus Aurelius wrote, in Meditations, Book 2, Paragraph 5, that every hour should be treated with firmness, as a Roman and as a man, doing what is in front of you with genuine and natural dignity. There is nothing dignified about a double ledger. There is only exhaustion, dressed up as competence. The spreadsheet version of you is not the fake one. It is the one who has been telling the truth this entire time, to an audience of exactly one, waiting for permission to finally speak to someone else. Why vulnerability about money feels like nakedness. There is a reason people will discuss their divorce, their diagnosis, their darkest year in therapy, and still flinch at stating their actual income. Money vulnerability strips away something that other vulnerabilities do not touch directly. It exposes not what happened to you, but what you have made of what happened to you. A breakup can be explained by someone else's choices. A diagnosis can be explained by biology. A bank balance, in the story most people tell themselves, has no one else to blame. It feels like a direct, unfiltered readout of your competence as a human being. This is why the confession feels like nakedness, not because the number itself is shameful, but because you believe it is a scoreboard with your name permanently attached to the result. You would expect the wealthy to feel the least of this shame, since they have the least reason to fear judgment. In practice, financial therapists report high earners hiding spending, debt, or losses just as often as anyone else, sometimes with more elaborate secrecy, because the fall from an image of success feels even further to travel. The nakedness is not about the amount. It is about the gap between the self you have performed and the self the number reveals. Epictetus argued, in Discourses, Book 2, Chapter 8, that the true measure of a person is found in the state of their own will and judgment, not in possessions external to it, since anything external can be taken away without touching who you actually are. If he is right, the number was never a verdict on your character in the first place. It was simply a fact, mistaken for a judgment because no one taught you the difference. You have been standing fully clothed this entire time, convinced you were naked, because you never tested whether the fear was accurate or simply inherited, unexamined, and never once put to the truth. What is actually yours to control here? Strip away everything you cannot control in this situation. You cannot control how your partner reacts when you finally speak. You cannot control whether a friend judges you for admitting a struggling year. You cannot control what your parents think, what a sibling assumes, or what a stranger at a dinner party silently concludes about your choices. Now notice what remains. What remains is smaller and far more powerful than anything on that first list. You control whether you speak the truth about your own financial life. You control the tone in which you say it. You control whether you prepare the conversation with honesty or continue managing it with performance. That is the entire list. It is short. It is also, according to Stoic thought, the only list that has ever mattered. Epictetus opened Discourses, Book 1, Chapter 1, with exactly this distinction, arguing that some things are within our power, such as our own judgment and effort, and some things are not, such as reputation, outcomes, and the opinions of others. He insisted that confusing these two categories is the source of almost all human disturbance. You have spent years trying to control the uncontrollable, their reaction, their judgment, their possible disappointment. None of that was ever yours to manage, and every hour spent managing it was an hour stolen from the one thing that actually was. In behavioral studies on financial disclosure, the anticipated reaction to a hard conversation is consistently rated by participants as far worse than the reaction they actually receive once the conversation happens. The fear is almost always larger than the event. You already know this. What remains once you release the outcome is a single decision available to you tonight. Not whether they will understand, whether you will finally tell the truth regardless of whether they do. The slow arithmetic of erosion. Trust does not usually collapse all at once. It erodes the way a coastline erodes, in increments too small to notice from any single day, until someone stands at the edge one morning and realizes the ground that used to be there is simply gone. Every unspoken number is a small wave. Every "we are fine" that was not entirely true is another. None of them, on their own, would sink anything. The damage is cumulative, not dramatic, which is exactly why so few people notice it happening until the shoreline has already moved. A couples therapist once described watching partners argue furiously over a $500 purchase, when the real argument buried underneath was about 11 years of small financial omissions neither had ever named directly. The purchase was never the issue. It was simply the wave that finally exposed how much coastline was already gone. Here's the detail that should concern you specifically. Studies on financial infidelity consistently show that the discovery of hidden financial behavior damages trust more severely than the financial impact itself. The dollar amount is rarely what breaks something. The deception surrounding it is. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, Book 5, paragraph 23, that we should constantly remind ourselves how quickly things change and pass away, since nothing in human affairs is stable for long. He meant it as comfort about mortality. It applies with equal force to trust. It is not a fixed structure. It is a living thing, maintained daily and depleted daily, by choices so small you rarely notice you are making them. You are not one dramatic confession away from repairing this. You are 1,000 small honest sentences away from it, starting with whichever one you have been postponing the longest. The coastline does not rebuild itself in a single storm of honesty. It rebuilds the same way it eroded, quietly, repeatedly, one unremarkable Tuesday at a time. When net worth becomes self-worth. At some point, without ever agreeing to it consciously, you started treating a number in an account as a referendum on your value as a human being. You do not remember the exact day this happened. There was no ceremony. It simply became the quiet operating system underneath everything else. This is why a bad month with money can produce a mood that has nothing rational to do with money. Irritability with a partner. Withdrawal from friends. A strange, specific shame that shows up in your body long before you consciously connect it to your bank balance. You are not your net worth. That sentence sounds like a poster in a therapist's waiting room, and yet almost no one who reads it actually believes it about themselves at 2 in the morning. A high-performing executive once described feeling more shame after a bad quarter's personal investments than after a public professional failure at work, because the investment loss felt like proof of something private and irreversible about his own judgment, rather than a circumstance that happened to him. Seneca wrote in Letters to Lucilius, letter 16, that philosophy shapes and molds the soul, orders one's life, and reveals what should and should not be done, and that without it, no one can live without fear or free from disturbance. Notice what he is pointing at. The disturbance was never the number. The disturbance is the unexamined belief that the number defines you. Once net worth and self-worth fuse together in your mind, every financial conversation stops being about logistics and starts being existential. That is why the conversation feels unbearable. You are not negotiating a budget. You believe, somewhere underneath language, that you are negotiating your own worth as a person. They were never the same thing. They only feel that way because no one ever separated them for you, and you have been carrying the weight of both alone for far longer than you needed to. The cost of being right instead of known. There is a version of every financial conversation where you win. You justify the purchase. You explain the decision until it sounds reasonable. You defend the number until the other person stops pushing, either convinced or simply exhausted. You walk away having been right. Here is the cost nobody accounts for. Every time you choose being right over being known, the other person learns slightly less about who you actually are, and slightly more about how skillfully you can manage a narrative under pressure. Being right is a short-term win. Being known is a long-term investment. Almost everyone unconsciously spends their entire relationship optimizing for the first at the direct expense of the second. You might assume the partner who wins every financial argument feels more secure in the relationship over time. Longitudinal research on marital conflict suggests the opposite. Couples who prioritize being understood over being victorious in financial disagreements report significantly higher long-term relationship satisfaction than those who prioritize winning the specific argument. Winning the argument and losing the intimacy are not two separate outcomes. In most homes, they are the exact same outcome wearing different clothes. Marcus Aurelius wrote, in Meditations, Book 6, paragraph 21, that if someone could prove him wrong about something, he would gladly change his view, since he sought the truth rather than his own vindication, and that no one was ever harmed by discovering the truth about themselves. Almost no one applies this standard to money conversations. Almost everyone applies the opposite standard, defending the position rather than examining what the position is protecting. You have been so busy winning these conversations that you never noticed you were losing something far more valuable in the process. Being known completely by the person you have spent years managing instead of trusting. What the Stoics knew about the conversation you are avoiding. The Stoics were not writing about savings accounts. They were writing across 3 centuries about a single recurring human failure, the habit of avoiding a difficult truth because the imagined pain of facing it feels larger than the actual pain ever turns out to be. Epictetus, once enslaved and later one of the most influential teachers in Rome, argued in Discourses, Book 3, Chapter 24, that we suffer not from events themselves, but from the opinions we form about them, and that a person who has trained their judgment correctly can face any circumstance without being shattered by it. He was not describing indifference. He was describing the difference between a fact and the catastrophe your mind builds around it, before the fact has even been spoken aloud. Epictetus taught this from direct experience with actual physical suffering, not theoretical comfort. If a man who survived slavery could develop the discipline to separate fact from imagined catastrophe, the conversation waiting for you tonight is not the impossible one you have been treating it as. Seneca, advisor to an emperor and one of the wealthiest men of his era, wrote in Letters to Lucilius, letter 18, that we should practice poverty deliberately from time to time, living simply and briefly, so that fear of loss never again controls our decisions. He understood something almost no modern financial conversation accounts for. The fear beneath the silence is rarely about the actual number. It is about an imagined collapse that has never been tested against reality. You have never actually tested it either. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the known world during his lifetime, still wrote private journals confronting his own fears, doubts, and failures with total honesty, never for an audience, only for the discipline of facing himself clearly. If an emperor needed that discipline, the belief that your situation is uniquely too shameful to speak aloud was never true. It was simply unexamined, the way almost everyone's shame is until someone finally examines it. The sentence that changes everything you inherited. Here is what nobody tells you about the conversation you have been avoiding. It does not require confidence. It does not require the perfect words, the right moment, or a guarantee of how the other person will respond. It requires exactly one thing: a single honest sentence, spoken once, out loud, to a person who deserves to actually know you, not the version of you performing composure, not the version of you managing their comfort, the version that exists only in the spreadsheet, finally given permission to speak in the room. This is for you specifically. Tonight, or tomorrow, or whichever ordinary evening you choose, there is a sentence sitting in your chest that you have rehearsed 100 times and said, 0. The gap between those two numbers is the entire distance between the relationship you have and the one you actually want. A couple who finally disclosed 8 years of separate hidden debt to each other did not describe the aftermath as devastating. They described it as the first time in nearly a decade they felt like they were standing in the same room instead of two adjacent ones. The number did not shrink. The distance did. Marcus Aurelius closed many of his private reflections not with certainty, but with a return to a single discipline, repeated daily, of facing what is true rather than what is comfortable. That discipline is available to you tonight, in a kitchen, at a dinner table, in a car with the engine still running because neither of you wants to go inside until this is finally said. You inherited the silence. You did not choose it, and you cannot undo the version of you who learned it by watching someone else's fear. But the next inheritance is yours to write. The version of this conversation your own child, or your closest friend, or the next person who loves you, will eventually learn by watching your face. They are watching already. What they see next is still, entirely, up to you. And underneath that decision sits a harder one still waiting, unexamined, in the room you have not entered yet. If silence about money is inherited, what else quietly unspoken has been passed to you the exact same way, waiting for someone in your family to finally be the first to say it out loud?